If you could first state your name, branch of service, and your rank, as well as your service dates, please.
Okay, I'm Bob Ulin. Name is Robert R. Ulin, but I go by Bob. I joined the Army in 1959, December 1959, and right out of high school. And well, actually, right out of junior college. I went to junior college and I failed miserably and decided I better find something else to do. And so I joined the Army and immediately went to Germany. Uh, so I was enlisted for 6.5 years. I was a staff sergeant before I went to officers candidate school. And then I was commissioned in 1966. Immediately went to Vietnam. And fast forward to 1992 when I retired from active duty. But since that time, since 1992, I've been in the defense industry for many years and have been working with the military my entire life.
Okay, and what made you choose the Army?
My dad. My dad was in World War II, and he was in the Army Air Corps. He was served on Iwo Jima. He was a Norden bomb site mechanic. And I remember when I was at our home in Santa Monica, California, I remember his buddies from the World War II coming and visiting with him, and I would sit at my dad's knee and listen to the stories, and so I was always fascinated by the military. And that's why when I decided to join the Army, it was an easy transition for me because my dad saw a lot of things, but he enjoyed the military and he benefited from the experience. And so I just naturally gravitated in the same direction.
Makes sense. Do you want to tell us some about your military experience?
Well,
Maybe
yeah,
start at the beginning.
It actually goes on for about 33 years. Probably the interesting part of the story is I was a 19-year-old, a private first class in Germany when the Berlin Wall went up. I was with the 280 millimeter atomic cannon. And I do remember at the onset of the Berlin crisis, we were on border patrol. Our guns were laid and facing Czechoslovakia, Eastern Europe at the time, part of the Warsaw Pact. Obviously, we didn't have atomic weapons up there. They were all high explosive, but the weapon itself was atomic capable. And my job was to build the atomic round. In other words, I was with a team of guys that the atomic round would come in several different boxes, and we had to assemble it and then put the fuse on it and everything, and then provide the weapon so that it could be loaded into the gun. That was theoretically, that's what was supposed to happen. But so here I am, 19 years old, secret clearance, working on building the atomic round, and that's how I started in the military. Fast forward, I'm later with Pershing missiles. We have really huge atomic weapons during that time, during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. And I was then later became a nuclear target planner, where I'd actually plot where nuclear weapons and the size of the weapon, and kind of factoring for the explosive power, how much it would destroy and what the immediate casualties and the long-term casualties would be. It's a pretty scary time. That was during the time of mutual assured destruction, that if nuclear war started, both Russia and the United States would be totally destroyed. So the idea is don't start one,
Right.
because it won't turn out well.
And how did that affect your civilian life while you were in as well, like your personal relationships and the like?
Well, I joined the Army when I was actually 17 and a half to the day when I joined the Army, and so I was single, of course. Then I went to Germany, and I married young. I married a German girl. She's the mother of my children. She later passed away. But she and her sisters had grown up in World War II. And their father was in the German Army, and he was an engineer, and he worked on the Peenemünde rocket up in the northern part of Germany. And the girls grew up down around Nuremberg. And so when I met Ute, my first wife, she had two sisters. Her mother and her dad was very ill. He had gotten diabetes and ultimately ended up having a leg removed. But he was really devastated by the war, and there wasn't much future for young people in Germany at that time. A lot of people don't know that a lot of German soldiers ended up joining the French Foreign Legion and going off and fighting. In fact, in Dien Bien Phu in North Vietnam, a lot of German soldiers were killed fighting for the French because there was no home. Germany is almost totally destroyed. I can remember being in Nuremberg, Germany, and I would say probably by the time I got there in 1960, probably a half of the city was still bombed out from World War II. Buildings totally destroyed. There were fences that would fence off the rubble, and there would be pictures of what used to be there, and they were rebuilding the city at the time. In fact, several times they would stop construction because they found unexploded bombs that had been dropped by aircraft, and they had to demilitarize or call in explosive ordnance disposal to take care of it. So it was a rough time in Germany. But yeah, I did that. That was 1960 to 62, I think. 62, 63. I did one tour. So I was in Germany at that time when the Berlin Wall went up. 38 years later, I was a colonel at NATO headquarters when the wall came down. So my military career really spanned the time of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall.
Wow, yeah, the rise and fall. How did seeing the rubble while you were in Germany affect you as far as your nuclear planning? And
No, not at all. Not at all. You do what you have to do. In fact, for a while there, when I was in the Pershing Missile Unit as an officer, I was a launch control officer, and there'd be two of us in the launch control trailer. Each one of us had a key, and you had to have two keys put in and turn them simultaneously to be able to launch the weapon. And of course, you had to have a code that would come in from the President of the United States that gave you the launch codes. They were locked in a safe, but you also had a PAL code. PAL was Permissive Action Link. All atomic weapons are locked, so that if somebody could launch them, they would be big duds as they go because they can't function. And that was something that we learned after the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis down in Cuba, of course. And it was the fact that both the Soviets and the Americans had these atomic or nuclear weapons. And you always worried about the Dr. Strangelove effect of somebody deciding they want to go to war and start pushing the buttons, and the next thing you know, we're in a thermonuclear war, global war. And so we locked the weapons, and then we gave that technology to the Soviets so that they could lock their weapons. That was really important. And that's still the case today. The weapons are locked. They can be unopened with a code. And so when you get a message down that there needs to be a launch, you get an unlock message for the weapon, and you get a launch message, to actually launch the missile or fire the artillery or so on. By the way, we have no more nuclear artillery in the United States. It's gone.
And so you started out enlisted,
Mm-hmm.
made it to the rank of staff sergeant, and then went to officer candidate school and commissioned.
Yeah.
What was that experience like, and what made you want to be an officer as opposed to staying enlisted?
Well, I left Germany in, I think it was 1962, September 1962, I think it was, after my first enlisted tour, 3 years. And then I came back to California and I went to work in the ballistic missile industry at Vandenberg Air Force Base. lived in Santa Maria, California. My dad he ran the Unmanned Space Test Center at Vandenberg Air Force Base for Douglas Aircraft Company. And I got a job there. He was the first shift foreman, so I ended up on the second shift, of course, because I couldn't work for my dad. Didn't want to work for my dad, actually. Not a good thing. And so I was involved in ballistic missile research and development for 3 or 4 years, I think it was. And we launched the first weather satellite. I can remember launching the missile that had the satellite on it, and then we jumped in our pickup truck and we went up to the telemetry station and we watched the first video feed come in. It wasn't really video. I guess it was a printout, actually, a digital printout of cloud cover over Baja, California. So back in those days, in the early 1960s, we probably about 25% of the missiles we launched either blew up, malfunctioned in some way, because that was all back in the research and development phase. And on the same Vandenberg Air Force Base, there were Minuteman missiles and there were Titan missiles, and they were going through the experiments. I never worked on those. I worked on the Thor, which was the lift vehicle for the weather satellites. But I did that. But quite honestly, I missed the relationship with the military, and so I went down in Santa Maria and I joined the local National Guard, which happened to be an artillery unit, 155 self-propelled. And so I joined that because I missed the camaraderie of the military and working with people. And of course, I was immediately made a gun chief because I had enlisted experience with the 280. And while I was there, somebody mentioned OCS, Officer Candidate School. And the California National Guard had a program called the California Military Academy. And it was a 2-year program. And so once a month, I would drive down to Long Beach, California. I don't remember how far it was. It was a good drive from Santa Maria. And I would drill on the weekends. And we did that for a year. Then we went to Camp San Luis Obispo and spent 2 weeks during the summer. Then we went back for another year, driving down every month to San Luis Obispo, I think, or down to Long Beach. I think I put about 5,000 miles on my car driving back and forth during this time. And then I was commissioned at the end of the second year. One of my classmates was the actor Tom Selleck. Yeah, he was a junior classman, and I used to drop him for push-ups. He probably doesn't remember me, but I remember him. And I don't know that he even graduated from the California Military Academy. He never went into the military, as far as I know. But once I was commissioned, I volunteered to go on active duty. Of course, it wasn't really hard back then because I was commissioned in '66 and the Vietnam War was really cranking up. And so I went to Vietnam, and my first tour, I went over as a second lieutenant on my first 15-month tour. And I came back having commanded an artillery battery in the Central Highlands as a captain for 6 months. And that was a really eye-opening experience. The battery that I was with fired 65,000 rounds of ammunition. And the guns were just smoking 24/7. It was amazing. We had 2 175s, 2 8-inches. Sometimes we'd have 4 fire missions. The guns would be facing out. Obviously, you have a fire base, and it's ringed with concertina wire and mines and trip flares and stuff like that. And we're on the inside, and the enemy's on the outside of that wire. So the front line is pretty close to where you are. And then we would fire in support of the infantry that was out. But that was an interesting experience as an artilleryman. And then after that tour, let's see, I got out and I was trained as a Pershing missile artilleryman because I had that civilian missile experience in California. And so they sent me to Pershing Missile School. And so I did a Pershing tour down in the 1st of the 81st Artillery in Neu-Ulm, Germany. And that was an interesting experience. We had a brigade of Pershing missiles. We had 3 or 4 battalions. And each battalion had a QRA site, quick reaction alert, where we actually had a Pershing missile with a nuclear warhead attached to it on a hard stand inside of a protected area that could launch at a moment's notice. I mean, once you got the message, you could, that missile would be off the launch pad in less than 10 minutes. It would just, you go vertical and then you shoot. Solid propellant. And I don't know if you've ever seen a solid propellant missile, but they move off the launch pad pretty fast. It's not like what you watch on television. The missile just slowly goes up with all that stuff. That's a liquid propellant. And the thrust builds over time. Solid propellant takes off like a rocket and goes downrange. And the thing that's interesting is when you think of World War II and Hiroshima, you know what the explosive power was of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima? No. 13 kilotons, 13 kilotons. On my Pershing warheads, we had 3 sizes. We had the first one, which is 60 kilotons. We had a 200 kiloton, and we had a 440 kiloton. So that's the kind of weapons that we were dealing with during that period. Massive. Up until 1971, we had 7,300 nuclear weapons in Europe. And they went all the way from the Pershing warheads down to a backpack atomic weapon that a soldier could put in a rucksack on his back and then go to a place and implant a small yield, a very small yield nuclear weapons. So things were pretty crazy during the Cold War. It was all about nukes. The Army turned most of their systems into nuclear. We even had a Jeep-mounted recoilless rifle. It was called a Davy Crockett. And it had a small nuclear weapon on it that would fire. And I can remember interviewing some of the cavalry troops that were on the ground, and they had this brand new Davy Crockett, and I was with the 280 millimeter atomic cannon at the time. So I asked them, I said, how far does that thing shoot? And they told me. And I said, well, what's the bursting radius? They found out they were inside the bursting radius because it really didn't go that far. So that wasn't a good weapon to be assigned to. And they finally did away with that.
And to put it into perspective, do you know what the blast radius was of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima versus?
Oh, wow. No, I don't. I can tell you that the casualties were somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 on Hiroshima. The way we fought in World War II was quite a bit different than the way we envision fighting today. We killed an awful lot of civilians in World War II. The firebombing of Tokyo, the bombing of Dresden, the bombs that were dropped over Berlin and all of that didn't destroy a lot of military targets, but killed a hell of a lot of people, destroyed an awful lot of buildings. We don't fight that way anymore in the United States. Now, when you look at what's happening today between Russia and Ukraine, you see that the Russians, they don't seem to be bothered by that. They're trying to systematically destroy the Ukraine, break the will of the people of Ukraine, destroy their infrastructure, make life miserable. In fact, they're fighting a war, I say it's kind of a barbaric form of war. Rape, pillage, plunder, they don't care. That's not the way the American Army operates. We follow the rules of war. And the rules after World War II, being such a horrendous war, were completely rewritten. And so we fight a lot differently in the United States.
And then, but what was the blast radius of the nuclear arms that you were in charge? So like the 400 and how many?
440. You know, I can't remember. It was a long time ago. I remember that when I went to the artillery school, and one of the first things they did back in those days for all artillery officers, we all needed to know how to plot our fires. In other words, you needed to know where you were and where you were going to strike and what the effects would be on the ground. And we had tables and books and stuff like that. It's all done computerized now, but we had to be proficient in math and a little bit of science and so on to learn how to do all this. But it was called Prefix 5. It was Nuclear and Chemical Weapons Employment Officer. And so I went through that training. And when I was with NATO headquarters, I would go in on exercises and I would actually plot targets and look at the range of what type of weapon we would put on it, what size. And of course, it had to be pretty thoroughly coordinated, because if you've got 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe in various forms, when you're firing at a target and another one comes in, it could destroy the other one. So everything had to be coordinated about its target laydown. One lands here, one lands there. When the effects of the blast of this one is gone, you can put another one in, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was pretty crazy when you think about it. And I write about it in my book that had we used all of the nuclear weapons we had in Europe and the Soviets used theirs, Europe would have been uninhabitable for thousands of years. We didn't dwell on that a lot because we always felt that if you really did get a message and that you had to launch those weapons, if you didn't, you'd be dead because they would strike you. Or you didn't know what else had happened. Maybe your country has already been destroyed. And so you don't think about the consequences. You just do it. You follow orders. You execute the plan.
Did you unpack all of that later on? Because you didn't think about it then. But
Well, we thought about it a little bit then, but it's kind of interesting when I look back now. You know how many nuclear weapons we have in Europe today? We have 100 B-61 bombs, and they're distributed in, I think, four or five European countries. They're all under U.S. control, and they're all bombs, so they can be dropped by aircraft. But the point is that we went from 7,300 in 1971 to 100 today. And I'm not even talking about strategic weapons. You know what I mean by strategic? These are these missiles in silos in the United States and in Russia that fly intercontinental and destroy each other's country. I'm talking about tactical weapons that are on the ground. Russians today reportedly have about 2,000 tactical weapons. We have 100. Some of their tactical weapons are small. It's kind of disheartening to hear that Putin talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield today. God only knows what would happen if that would start. The problem with nuclear weapons is escalation control. In other words, they shoot a small one, we shoot one, they shoot one, we shoot one. Next thing you know, you end up with a global conflagration. It could go to that. We talked about those kinds of things, of course, all the time. When I was with the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, we used to write position papers on various things. How would we react if, sort of thing. And you'd have all these scenarios that you would develop. There's no good answers. There's no good answers to any of this. But you can't say that we're not going to do anything, because the other side will take advantage of that. So it got a little scary at times, and the way you protect yourself is not by diving under your desk, like they used to show in the old movies, the kids would dive under their desk and stuff. When I grew up, we saw those videos every day on television on how to protect yourself from a nuclear attack. And it was really silly. Didn't make sense. We built bomb shelters all over the place. People could buy bomb shelters to bury in their backyard so you could go into them. Yeah, it was a different time. So we thought about it a lot kind of growing up. And then when I was in the Army, I thought about it a lot. But hey, that was life.
Yeah. So do you feel like your thoughts on it changed as you gained more knowledge of reality?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so
Certainly.
today, what would you do if you don't have control of launch codes, what would be the strategy as a civilian, in your opinion?
Well, we sort of have the same theory right now of mutual assured destruction. In other words, it's so horrific that you don't want to start it because you can't control it. And if you can't control it, they're almost useless weapons. It's one of the reasons we haven't ever used them. Back in the 1950s, of course, we used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But back in the 1950s, about 60 miles northwest, I think, of Nevada, there's an area called Frenchman Flat, Nevada, big area. There were over 100 above-ground nuclear detonations during that period. That was a time when we were testing weapons. In fact, I've got some old movies that show people in Las Vegas on the Strip looking at mushroom clouds in the distance. And so there was a lot of testing done during that period. We don't do any above ground testing anymore. In fact, we don't even do below ground testing anymore. And so a lot of that has been de-emphasized over time. And at the end, towards the end of the Cold War, when things got really shaky, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. But in 1983, there was a Soviet war scare. And I mentioned, before we got started here, I mentioned that there was a top secret document recently declassified about the so-called Soviet war scare of 1983 that happened in conjunction with the Able Archer nuclear exercise. And it was that exercise would be conducted at SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and I was there at the time. I was a lieutenant colonel. I was a policy analyst, and I was a nuclear war planner. So I was in the exercise. The Soviets misinterpreted that exercise and almost launched a nuclear weapon at us, thinking that we were getting ready to launch one at them. So the signaling is really important, and your intelligence capability is really important. I was shocked to know that this had occurred, and I didn't even know about it. And I was there at the exercise. But the document was declassified in 2015. It's on the World Wide Web. In fact, I'm preparing a presentation on it now. I'm going to be delivering in a couple weeks, well, probably a week and a half, up in Des Moines, Iowa. There's a national security forum we have up there, and I'm going to talk about that. It's really important that we understand what our capabilities are and what our potential enemies' capabilities are, and the dangers of not recognizing what is occurring and having good intelligence. Because you can make a terrible mistake and send the wrong signals, do all the wrong things, scare the hell out of the other side, and they decide to preemptively attack you. So that kind of signaling is very important. And so we need to pay a little bit more attention to that. And I'm very troubled today by the declining defense budgets, by the difficulty that the military has had recruiting, by the fact that most people have no idea what the hell's going on. I mean, they just live their life and they go about it. And I guess we don't want to burden people with that. But we're talking about survival of the state, which is really important. And so I think I would hope that we'd pay a lot more attention to things like this and not allow ourselves to slip into this apathy and this let our weapons systems deteriorate and let our capabilities deteriorate to the point where the other side decides that they can take advantage of us. And the other side is China and Russia.
Right. And do you have any thoughts on why there has been a decline in interest in joining the armed forces and maybe a solution?
I meet with a group of guys every Saturday. We talk about stuff like this. Part of it is that there are a lot of agencies and organizations now taking care of vets that have had experiences in the Gulf War that lasted some 20 years, right? You were there, right?
I was.
Okay. And there's a lot of wounded veterans, and there's always a lot of talk about the VA, and I'm partially disabled as well from my time in the service, and I use the VA, and I think it's wonderful. They do a good job. So it's all situation dependent. But my friends, they sort of think that with all of these poor disabled soldiers that we see in the Tunnels of Tower Foundation, and you see these advertisements all the time to guys with prosthesis and so on, that they think that it is scaring the young people to the point where they don't want to join the military service. There could be some of that. I don't know. Life is difficult, right? I mean, you can go into the police, you can go into fire, you could go into just normal business and have a car accident and get killed on the way to work. You know, life's tough, and then you die. You know, and it's the way it is. So I don't think it's that. I do think that a lot of the things that have crept into society, like the woke culture and all of that, I think that has an effect on people and how they see themselves and see others. And we're so terribly pitted against each other these days politically that I think it's sad to see that happen to the country. Not the country I grew up in, but it's. I think if something were to happen where we were attacked from the outside, like the 9/11 attack, people would rally to the flag again. But right now, without this, something to focus on to take us away from the petty political differences that we have, we're going to be at each other's throats all the time. I think it's just human nature. Sorry to say.
No, I see where you're coming from. And then as far as retention in the military right now, do you see that differently from recruiting? Like people who are already in,
Yeah.
Do you see that as a different situation? Or
Actually, service in the military is pretty darn good. You got to realize, I joined the Army when I was right out of high school. I went to junior college. I failed miserably. Got bad grades. Finally decided I need to do something with my life rather than waste my time here in junior college. I'm not suggesting people don't go to junior college, especially where I'm sitting here. But I didn't have a focus. So what happened is I was commissioned before I was a college graduate. That doesn't happen today. I was a commissioned officer. I went to Vietnam. I spent 15 months in the Central Highlands as an artilleryman, and then I went back to Vietnam, and I spent 15 months in the Mekong Delta down in the bottom of Vietnam as an infantry advisor. There were 5 Americans, and we lived with 35,000 Vietnamese and 5,000 Cambodians. You had to make a lot of friends. We were on combat operations all the time. I'm an artilleryman with a combat infantryman's badge. You don't see that today, right? No. So I've been a combat artilleryman and a combat infantryman. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about other people. And I learned how to get along and what it takes to survive in that type of an environment. And it conditioned me when I came out of Vietnam. I was a different person. And I don't think I had PTSD, but then again, I'm not sure. But I do know the Army said to me, well, do you want to stay in the Army? I said, yes. And they said, well, then you need to get an undergraduate degree. And I said, okay. And they said, well, go find a school that'll take you and we'll send you. So I went to Cameron College, which is right outside of Fort Sill. And I went there for 18 months and got a 4-year degree. Now, how the hell did I do that? Well, I went to the Education Center and I tested out a lot of things. Well, you got to think of all those military schools. I was plotting targets, a lot of mathematics and so on. I was writing reports, so my English skills were better. And so all the things that I did in the military, all the training that I received, prepared me to just take those exams and just pass them all. And so I passed a lot of those and took some mandatory courses and got a bachelor's degree in general studies. It was called the Bootstrap program. Park College was a bootstrap organization. University of Nebraska at Omaha was one, Cameron College in Oklahoma, and I'm sure there were others. But a lot of guys coming out of Vietnam that didn't have degrees went and got degrees. Well, after I went through it, it just opened my eyes. I was in my late 20s. I was an adult learner by then. And so I focused on my grades and got A's and B's throughout. Then I started, when I came to Command General Staff College as a young major, I didn't have a master's degree, and I signed up for the program at KU, and I got a master's degree in Middle Eastern and Soviet Studies. So I got that, and then when I got to Europe, after I was at SHAPE headquarters, I was assigned to the embassy in Brussels, and I was the Chief of Army Affairs of the Office of Defense Cooperation for Belgium and Luxembourg, and I was in the diplomatic corps. I wore civilian clothes every day, was a military officer, negotiated agreements between the United States and Belgium, was an advisor to the Belgian paracommandos, used to go parachute with them and kind of have fun in the field, if you will. And so I decided to get another master's degree. So using my GI Bill, I got a master's in international relations with a focus on European institutions. And I got that in Brussels. And my teachers were people who were in the European Community headquarters, the NATO headquarters, and the various other establishments there in Belgium. And got a 4.0 there. And then later, the Army sent me to Harvard to the Kennedy School of Government, where I've got a executive management program in national security. No student loans. All that education, no student loans. And I was on 2 graduate faculties for a total of 7 years. And so co-authored 2 books on European security policy. I wrote a personal memoir that I have here, and then I wrote 2 business books afterwards. So I've been involved in academia now for, a number of years. But all thanks to the Army. I don't know that I would have been motivated to go do that or had the opportunity. My GI Bill was wonderful. I have absolutely no student loans and got 2 master's degrees, 1 honorary master's, and the executive management program at Harvard. So it's a pretty good deal.
It sounds like you had a good career laddering program where one thing just led into the next, and you were interested in what you were doing.
Well, and what the Army does is they'll offer you a school, and then you incur more obligation. Mm-hmm. So you get the school, and they say, oh, you owe us 2 years. So you stay 2 years, then you see another school, and you take that, and then you add a little bit. Then you wake up one day and say, holy mackerel, where's all the time gone?
Did you have leaders while you were in that kind of pushed you on to the next thing?
Yeah,
what were those mentors
I had good leaders. Probably the one that made the biggest impact on my life was a Lieutenant Colonel Vetter Driscoll. And he was a artilleryman. and he was my artillery battalion commander in Vietnam. And I can remember signing up for the unit. And actually, we formed a 175 millimeter 8-inch battalion at Fort Irwin, California. And I showed up, and I was the first officer there for this unit. And so I can remember this young captain saying, well, you're the first one, so you're the battalion commander. I'm a second lieutenant, right? I'm thinking, what? Here are the keys to the buildings. And then the next day, another second lieutenant came in, and he ranked me by 2 weeks. And so he became the battalion commander, and I was the battalion exec. And so every day I got bumped down as new people came on board. But we formed this battalion, over 550 of us, and we were training on the 175 millimeter gun. And we were all training to go to Vietnam. And the battalion commander was Vetter Driscoll. And he had received a battlefield commission at Anzio Beach in World War II. And he was fluent in Russian and Bulgarian, and I think he was came from European stock, former Eastern European. But he was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful mentor. And I remember walking into his office, and he says, well, what job do you want? I said, I want to be a battery commander. Hell, I'm a second lieutenant. Battery commanders are seasoned captains. And he says, well, I think we need a little work on this. So he made me, because of my ballistic missile background and working with mechanics and stuff, he made me the battalion motor officer. And I thought, wow, big deal. I'm going to fix trucks. It turned out one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I was really good at it. Went in, and as we got all this new equipment, we were in processing the new equipment, and we were training people on how to use it and so on and so forth. So I learned an awful lot from that. And then when we got to Vietnam, they made me the service battery commander, and as service battery executive officer, I had 2 jobs. I was responsible for providing artillery to the firing batteries, so I would lead convoys of trucks over mined roads to take the artillery into them. And then my second job was an aerial observer. So they sent me down to the airport, and I learned how to fly. Now, I wasn't a pilot. I sat in the back seat and directed the guns, but I could learn how to fly I learned how to fly the aircraft to land it in the event that the pilot was killed. So you sit right behind the pilot in this single-engine airplane, which is really kind of weird. Very confined in the back seat. We all used to sit on our parachutes rather than put them on, because I felt, well, number one, if I put this parachute on, I'll never get out of this damn airplane if something happens to it, because you had little windows that went up like that. There was no doors in the back. But chances are I would get shot in the butt from the ground. So sit on the parachute and let it collect the bullets. So we did that. And then in my time in Vietnam, I had over 500 hours of flying in helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. Not as a pilot, but as an aerial observer or an air mission commander. So I had that experience. But Colonel Driscoll he gave me a lot of opportunity. And I remember I went to his retirement at Fort Myer, Virginia, and he had 38 years of service when he finally retired as a full colonel. And he gave me his colonel's eagles and says, you will wear these someday. And in fact, I did, and got pinned with his eagles. And the inspiration that he gave me, the leadership, the coaching, and the mentoring changed my life. So I think it's so important that a mentor is not something that gets assigned to you. A mentor is somebody that takes an interest in you and then is willing to coach you and so on and so forth, through good times and bad.
Right. And so I imagine you've been a mentor to people throughout your career, of course.
Quite a few. quite a few.
Do you want to talk about some people that you've mentored and maybe how?
Well, yeah, of course, in the military, I had junior officers that I still know and I still communicate with. In fact, my Jeep driver, when I was with the artillery in the Central Highlands, I still communicate with him. God, that's been a long time. That's been 1968, 69. And he lives in Connecticut. Haven't gotten back to see him, but when I wrote my book, I had this book, Witness to History, that I wrote. And that was kind of a cathartic experience to go through. I'm a good note taker, and so I carried little tablets and stuff in my pockets and my fatigues, and I would write down things. In fact, I have prisoner of war interrogations and so on and so forth that I would write down. I don't want to call it a diary because we're not supposed to keep diaries, so I'll call it something else. It's my notes. But I kept all of that. And then, you remember those spiral notebooks that we used to have, secretary's notebooks, that little spiral on the top, had a hardcover on, you'd open it up and line. Okay. I've got about 15 of those things completed. And I can remember using those in my assignments at the embassy, in Brussels, and so on. And so writing this book was not that difficult, because what I did is I sat down and I actually wrote 120 pages in, I think it was 4 weeks. Stream of consciousness. I just sat down and I just started knocking it out. Because the hardest thing about writing a book is starting. So I just used my memory and I I wrote, put it away, went back 3 months later, looked at it. It was really bad because it was all over the place. So I had to put things in context and decided to do a chronology, you know, where I started, where I finished, sort of thing. At the time, I was the CEO of a foundation, Command and General Staff College Foundation in Leavenworth. And I didn't write about that. I just wrote about my Vietnam experience. And I went back through the notes and so on. And it was really kind of a cathartic experience to recall all these things that I had experienced in my life in the military. Some good, some bad. The Army I joined was a draft Army. Some of the people that were drafted weren't very nice people. And we were, you know, back in the day, the judge would say, you're going to jail or you're going in the Army. And some people would go in the Army. And they were bad actors. And I can remember being a young captain in command of a unit myself, and I spent 90% of my time with 10% of my troublemakers. And unfortunately, kind of ignoring the guys that were doing good jobs. Why? Because they weren't a problem for me. I was dealing with this element that we had in the military that wasn't very good. So then, of course, we then transitioned to the volunteer Army. So when people ask me about, well, shouldn't we have a draft Army? The answer is absolutely not. We don't need that, because you have a lot of grief. I mean, we had murders and beatings and drugs. It's horrible. It's sort of like some of these terrible inner city problems that we're having in the United States. Running units was about like that. It was not fun. But with the volunteer Army, you end up with a higher caliber of people, and things turn out a little bit better. And so I learned all that. And another thing, during the Vietnam War, McNamara, Secretary of Defense McNamara started a program called Project 100,000. You've been in the military, so you take the ASVAB, which is that aptitude test that you take, and you get broken down into mental categories. I think there's 4 or 5 mental categories. Well, if the last 2 mental categories, we don't bring those people in the military. They just don't have the emotional stability or background experience, education, abilities to function. So we don't bring them in. But what McNamara did, rather than start drafting some of these young people that were, going to college and ended up with these college exemptions so they didn't get drafted, they started taking people from the lower two mental categories. Well, it didn't turn out to be 100,000. It turned out to be 340,000. And I didn't realize it at the time, but a large percentage of my unit in Vietnam were these lower mental categories. That helps explain a lot some of the problems that we had, because it was still a draft army in Vietnam. I mean, we had guys that just, they'd wake up and they just decide to start shooting in the air. Well, if you're in combat and somebody's shooting, it really kind of gets your attention, right? Like, is that coming in for me? Is that outgoing, or is it incoming, or whatever? So we had that, and I had a mutiny in my outfit where the soldiers had their weapons and they were ready to take over the outfit because somebody, one of the sergeants, had been providing them hard liquor on the fire base. And I'm telling you, alcohol and gunpowder does not mix well. Somebody's going to get in trouble. So we had a zero tolerance for hard liquor on the fire base. But we had an NCO that was doing that. Well, I fired this guy and I took him off while I was gone. The soldiers broke into the supply room. We had beer, and we had 1 can per man per day that we could issue. And they broke in and started drinking beer, and then the guns came out. And so I drove this NCO to the battalion headquarters, and then I jumped on the helicopter and came back through the officers' quarters. And then, strapped on my .45 and grabbed my M16 and went out on the porch and put down the mutiny, basically. And the way I did it was I read them the paragraph on mutiny from the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You know what the punishment is? Death. And they started to sober up a little bit when they heard that message. And then some of the NCOs started to, turn around, and the whole thing was suppressed. Myself and my officers slept with loaded guns for almost a month after that incident. That was scary. That was really scary, especially after another incident that I talk about where the first sergeant of our Bravo battery was murdered by his own soldiers. They threw a hand grenade into his hooch and blew him up. Called a fragging incident. You ever heard of that?
Like fratricide type? Yeah.
Well, fragging was hand grenades.
Right.
They throw it in there and purposely killed him. So those are some of the experiences that we had in Vietnam. I tell you, you grow up fast. You go over there as a youngster in your late teens or early 20s. And after you come back from combat, you know this because you've been in a combat situation, you're a changed person. All of a sudden, all your senses are heightened. It's to the point of almost absurdity. I can remember coming back from Vietnam and driving down a tree-lined road would freak me out because I was afraid somebody was going to jump out and ambush me. And because those are the experiences that you've been living through all this time. And of course, when you're a civilian, you're not packing, you're not carrying guns or anything like that. Well, in Vietnam, you're fully geared up all the time. And that's just the way it is. So it does change you. But if you let it get to you and you dwell on it, it can destroy you. And look at all the young people that we've had these past few years that have committed suicide. That's a terrible situation. And I don't know how to solve that, of course. I don't think anybody does. But I would tell you that a lot of the people that I saw that came out of Vietnam that were really in bad shape psychologically and even sometimes physically, they weren't in good mental or physical state before they went. You see what I'm getting at? Yeah. I mean, they hadn't prepared themselves mentally, they hadn't prepared themselves physically, and they went over there and got exposed to all these challenges, and some of the physical challenges are pretty daunting, and the psychological challenges are pretty tough, and they just come apart. So we need to do a better job of preparing people to go, and then we need to do a better job of transitioning them out of that experience, and then reintegrating them into society. For instance, when I retired from the Army 30 years ago, for God's sake, so I've been out, worked for defense industry and stuff like that. But one of the things that I did is I started a nonprofit called the Center for Transitional Leadership. And that's this book right here that I wrote, Transitions. And this is the field guide for mid-career professionals and veterans seeking new challenges in the business world. Because when I got out of the military in 1992, I was on orders to be the defense attaché to Germany, and I thought I was going to Germany for another tour. But at 1992, the Army was downsizing because of the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed on December the 25th, 1991. I mean, it was no longer the Soviet Union. So the threat had gone away. So the Army was starting to downsize. So one minute I'm on orders to go to Germany as a defense attaché. Next, I get this letter saying, well, you're going to have to retire. Well, I was retirement eligible, so it was okay. But I hadn't prepared to think about, what am I going to do when the Army's over with? And so I was unemployed for 2 years. I started my own business. I did multi-level marketing for a while. Started my own business, failed successfully. In other words, I think I was making probably as much money as I was spending, but my wife reminded me, this is really a lousy business plan. I mean, if you're going to do this, you need to figure out how to make some money. Now, I did have my military retirement, so I wasn't destitute or anything like that. So I had a tough transition, and then one day I get a call from a friend of mine. He was a retired 2-star general, and he was in Europe. And he said, hey, Bob, he said, I need a political military analyst, and that was my secondary specialty, political military. And he said, I'm working on an exercise here. We're evaluating an exercise. Would you like to come over and join us? And I said, does it pay? And he said, yeah, $500 a day. I said, I'm your man. And so I jumped on a plane. I said, oh, by the way, where are you? And he said, Grafenwehr, Germany. So I jumped on a plane and went to Grafenwehr, Germany. And for 6 weeks, we were involved in this exercise. And the military was out doing their thing, and we were collecting lessons learned and reports and kind of writing up an analysis of what they were doing and so on. And the program manager of the outfit said, hey, look, he said, you're pretty good at this. Would you be interested in opening up a research center at headquarters U.S. Army Europe? And I said, hell yeah, I'd do that. Didn't know what I was doing, but I figured, how hard can it be, right? So I did that. And we were working with the headquarters U.S. Army when the troops were moving into Bosnia at the time, crossing the Sava River and so on. There was a lot of stuff going on. And so I did that for about 18 months. I had 19 colonels. They were all War College graduates, 2 retired major generals and a retired ambassador working for me. And that's where I got my start in defense industry. And then I spent 12 years in the defense industry, and then got hired by an outfit in Overland Park, and I was their vice president for government services. And so, like I said, I've been working, like doing things for the government my whole career, it seems like. So I did that. And so And then I stepped down from that job, being a vice president of a corporation. I went back to the Command General Staff College, and I said, I think I'm going to spend my twilight years teaching college and teaching national security policy. And shortly thereafter, I was asked to stand up a foundation to support the college, and that's what I did. And so I spent 7.5 years as CEO of the Command and General Staff College Foundation, raised $13 million. But what I did is you'd be surprised the number of people I had walking into my office saying, I'm going to have to retire pretty soon, but I don't know what to do. So I wrote this book because I took my own experience and knowing what I knew about the business world, and I had hired a lot of retired military people, and most of them were ill-prepared. They didn't know how to present themselves. They didn't know how to talk about, they could talk about military things, but that's not what business people want to hear. How can you do things for me? How can you help us make money? What are your skills, knowledge, and abilities that you have that you can add value to my company? They didn't know how to articulate that because they'd never been asked that question before. And so I took them through a process, how to interview, how to prepare for interviews, how to negotiate for a salary. You don't negotiate for a salary of the military. You get paid off the pay table, right? So that's what I wrote about there, and I ran that for 6.5 years. And 65% of them, of that 272, took private sector jobs, and 14 of them became vice presidents or C-level executives. So it's a pretty good program. And it was a nonprofit. So I did that. And then I was asked to come back to the foundation and help them out. So now I run the Simon Center for Interagency Cooperation, actually renamed Simon Center for Ethical Leadership and Interagency Cooperation. It's a program of the Command General Staff College Foundation. And we do research and writing and so on. And I just sent the galley proofs in on a book on the Cold War and its aftermath. And that's going to be coming out probably next month. And then I've got another manuscript where we're looking at arms control verification. So that's what I do. And I work out of my house and I read, I write, give presentations, run a program in Kansas City, a national security program, once a month, invite speakers in. So I'm staying as active as I can because I've been blessed. I just turned 81. I'm still healthy, feel good every morning, exercise every day, try to eat right. Sometimes that doesn't work out so well. But as long as I'm capable of doing something, I will probably work to the day I die because that's what I like doing. And it's all because I had a great experience in the military, ended up with a magnificent education, with experiences beyond my wildest imagination, and it helped me. It helped me prepare to be successful in the private sector.
And then, so I think we've covered almost beginning to end of your career. What's your family life during this time? When do you start having kids? And
well, my first wife passed, and my second wife, we were divorced. So I've been married 3 times. Military can be kind of tough on keeping a relationship together. And it doesn't happen all the time, but it does. I mean, you spend a lot of time away from home. I really spent a lot of time away from my children during the Vietnam War because I was either getting ready to go to war, I was at war, or I was recovering from coming to war. I moved 17 times during my military career. I spent 20 years outside the United States, 33 years in the Army, 20 years outside the United States. I was an advisor to the Vietnamese. I was advisor to the Belgian Army. So I'm a qualified advisor. I'm an author. I'm a scholar. You know, writing books and teaching at graduate school. 7 years of teaching at graduate school levels. And of course, it all requires time away from home, getting prepared for, and so on and so forth. The rigors of military life can be difficult. Right now, I've been happily married to the same lady for over 30 years. She was a vice president of a corporation. She gets it. She was in the private sector. And when you're starting a business, it's just like being in the Army. You spend a lot of time away from home.
Are any of your kids in the military?
Yes, in fact, my son and daughter both joined the Army. Well, at one time, this is interesting. At one time, my second wife was a military intelligence officer. So I was married. My wife was in the military. She's a military intelligence officer. My daughter graduated from Wichita State University as a medical service officer. And my son was in the 82nd Airborne Division. So at one time, you know, and my brother was in the Army, and he was in Turkey at a nuclear weapons storage depot. So there were 5 members of my family in uniform at the same time. I'm the only one that made a career out of it. Both of my children have done exceedingly well in the private sector, and so I'm very proud of them. I have 4 grandchildren, and I have 4 great-grandchildren. So family life is good.
Yeah. Sounds like you've really earned it. Are you taking some time with the family now?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, life gets pretty exciting at our house when they all show up. Yeah. Everybody has dogs. The dogs come in and the kids come in. So it's absolute chaos, you know, until they leave. But it's such a blessing to see the third generation of the family develop and grow, and it's very exciting.
Is there anything else you want to add about your time?
No, I first of all, I appreciate what you guys do here. You know, focusing on veterans. We had a meeting. We went to an Army ball here recently, and they asked for all the World War II vets to stand up. None were there. That's interesting. Of course, they're in their 90s now. They asked for Korean War vets to stand up, and there were none there. They're all in their late 80s right now. And then they asked the Vietnam vets to stand up, and there was a few of us. But I'm 81, and I joined the Army when I was 17. So now my generation is, you know, moving on. And then the younger generation, and I really admire your generation, and I'll tell you why. A lot of you guys joined the Army when we were at war. It takes a lot of guts to do that. We were not at war when I joined. We were at Cold War, but it's a little different. But for your generation that joined during the Gulf War, it takes a lot of guts to do that, because you know you're going to combat. You're going to be serving downrange. And it does take its toll. And if your training is good and you're lucky to be surrounded with good leaders and mentors and coaches and things like that, you'll do very well.
And I guess to touch on the good mentors and leaders, do you feel like we still have that good leadership in the armed forces right now? And you know, maybe what's your opinion overall on that, and how do we improve?
No, I think we have good leaders. There's an old saying many years ago that leaders are born, not trained. I don't buy that. You're not born with any innate leadership ability. It's something that you learn over time. I've worked for really good people, both in the military and the private sector, and I've worked for some real scoundrels. I've worked for military people that, you know, would holler and chew your ass and and swear at you constantly. That was the old Army when I was younger. The new Army's not that way. We're kindler and gentler. Sometimes that's not so good, because sometimes, you know, they need to jerk a knot in your ass because you're not doing the right thing. And I'm okay with that. But you also have to be a good listener, and you got to be able to help people work through some of the problems that they have. I think our NCO Corps is the best in the world. You know, one of the reasons the Russians are failing in Ukraine right now, they have no NCO Corps. They don't have non-commissioned officers. Their junior officers do those jobs. Our NCO Corps is the best in the world because they are closer to the soldiers as far as teaching and mentoring and coaching and so on. So that's a really important element that we have in our Army. And I'm very proud of the way our NCO Corps has developed.
Yeah, and I'm sure you saw it firsthand, having been an NCO and then transitioning into the officer corps.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to BS me when I became an officer, having been an NCO.
Yeah, yeah, and I think in the modern Army, right, then a lot of good officers have NCO mentors. And
well, if I were king for a day, I would make sure that everybody has a chance to be enlisted, even officers, and be NCOs, and then become officers. But just becoming an officer without any previous experience, probably not so good. But I'm not king for a day, and so I can't change it. But just knowing what my experience is and the way I grew up and what I experienced, I think we would be better served by taking these young people, moving them through the ranks, muddy boot soldier, you know, living in foxholes, doing the grunt work, developing into NCOs with a group of people that they can train and educate and mentor, and then deciding to take the path to become officers. That would be my preferred solution. But nobody's asked me that. I don't think they care.
do you have any final thoughts or anything?
No, I just appreciate what you all are doing, capturing these stories. The big question is, how are they going to be used? And how can we benefit from the collective experience that we pull together? That's always the big challenge. I have a lot of faith in education. I think it's very important. I believe in classical education, teaching the Constitution, the development of the country, and all this. I'm really disturbed about what's happening now in schools, and the direction things are going is really troubling to me. But then I grew up in the 50s. And the 50s was probably the most wonderful time in this country, all this creativity and innovation. And yeah, it's we're going through some difficult times right now. So I just hope that something happens that we get better.
Me too.
That's all I've got.
All right. Well, thank you.
My
We
pleasure.
appreciate you coming and speaking with us today.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.